Sam and Elizabeth Colt reshaped the culture and economy of Hartford. They didn't do it all by themselves, but they, more than anyone in the 19th century, they laid down the tracks that established the course of the future for the city. And industrialization, which is the business of manufacturing things, was a relatively new idea, at least on a big scale. I mean, if you go back to the 18th century, the period of Leffler and Aaron Chapin and Daniel Burnap and the people that did such wonderful things right here in South Windsor, these manufacturing, as they understood it, was a small enterprise. It was, you know, you might be a farmer in the summer, and then in the winter you'd have a little shop, and you might make some furniture or something, pottery. But manufacturing became a huge enterprise and much bigger, with using machines and technology, and it changed everything. And so the Colts, when I started out at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is what brought me here in 1980, nobody had done any research. They had this Colt collection because when Elizabeth Colt died in 1905, she was the first woman in America to do this. She left them a big pot of money to build a memorial building, the Colt Memorial Wing, and this incredible collection that today, if you cashed out, would probably be worth $300 million or more. You know, big deal. And nobody's really researched or paid a whole lot of attention to it. So I got going on this project, and it was the most important thing, I think, that I was able to do during my tenure at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and I'm proud of this. The exhibition, museum exhibit, spawned a national park. One led directly to the other, and we had Congressman John Larson and the Hartford Current and others thinking, boy, this is a great story. What are we going to do? We've still got the Armory and all that. So that's how I got going. And let me just see. And my friend Doris Bergdorf was going to come tonight, but she decided it was too cold. I was just at her house a minute ago, and she wanted me to tell everybody that there were Colts right here on Main Street in South Windsor, and we don't know. We have somebody, if they've got Ancestry.com, they could maybe figure it out. But Jabez Colt appears in Styles' History of Windsor, living right on Main Street. He would have been about the right age to have been the father of this fellow, Benjamin Colt. Well, he's not there, it's his gravestone. And so it's possible that this Jabez Colt was maybe a great-grandfather of Sam Colt, but I'm not saying that's the case. But there were small family, they weren't everywhere, but they were here. And Sam Colt's grandfather, whose gravestone is there, lived in Hadley, Massachusetts. And Sam Colt's mother, shown on the left here, it's kind of a tragic story. She died when he was 7. And this was not uncommon in colonial or early America. You know, medicine wasn't that great, and there were a lot of families that were, you know, you didn't have welfare as we know it today. If you had a problem, you went off to the cousins. You know, I mean, families took care of each other in that way, and that's the way the world worked. So when Sam Colt's mother dies, Sam Colt is shipped off to Hadley, where the grandfather was and where there were cousins. So that's predominantly where he was raised. It was interesting, Colt's grandfather on his mother's side was kind of a blue blood. You know, her father, Colonel John Caldwell, was a West Indies merchant, a big, you know, he was kind of like Ebenezer Grant here in South Windsor, big shot. And when his daughter married this reckless kind of gambler that was Christopher Colt, who was Sam Colt's father, there was a little bit of turbulence because maybe the family weren't so sure who this Colt was. And then he went bankrupt, and then the mother dies. So they were kind of kicked off the social register, if that kind of thing existed. And so such is life, and off he went to Hadley. And he had learning disabilities, I guess you could say, or at least a disciplinary problem. He kept getting thrown out of school and getting in trouble. And they sent him to Amherst Academy which eventually became Amherst College, but it was just like a little private school, and that didn't work out too well. So the family decided that maybe going into the military would straighten him up. So they put him in what you might now call the merchant marine, and off he went to sea at the age of 18, 17, and it was at sea, traveled around the world on a merchant boat, and it was at that time that he came up with the concept of the revolver. And he came up with the idea because the mechanisms for steering these ships had these great wheels with little ratchets on them, and so that you could, it's sort of like cruise control in a car. You could, if you were sort of tacking a little bit to the west or starboard, the ratchet would kick into gear and it would hold the wheel in place. And he kept watching this wheel and ratchet mechanism. And he had always been interested in explosives and guns and things like that. So he came up with this concept of the revolver. And it took him from 1832, when he first had the idea, until 1847, before he actually was successful at launching a business. He tried in New Jersey in 1840, actually in 1839, and it failed. But in Hartford in 1847, it gets started. And this is actually the New Jersey factory here that they had in Paterson, New Jersey. And these are some of the guns in the Wadsworth Athenaeum collection. What's really interesting, Elizabeth Colt, among many other things that she left the Athenaeum, was Sam's personal collection of experimental rifles and experimental models and patent models, the rarest stuff on earth. Things in many cases that only exist as single examples of what they are. And but he takes out these patents, and Sam Colt's claim to fame, or one of them, is that he developed the first practical repeating firearm. There have been other people that had figured out how to make, practical revolver and a repeating firearm. There have been others that had come up with a revolver concept, but it didn't work, or it didn't work well. But he not only perfected the design so that it was predictable, more predictable than the computers and the laptops, I might add. The laptops and the projectors, so we still have work on that front. So it was predictable, but it was also practical and an economic standpoint. They figured out how to mass produce these and get them into the marketplace at a cost that made sense. Well, it's 1847, and this is a little pop quiz. What was going on militarily and politically in 1847?
Crimean War?
Good, very good guess, but no, that was in Europe, in the U.S. Mexican War. And the Mexican War, which people kind of forget, it was sort of like Vietnam, very controversial. The South liked it, but the North hated it. And, but nonetheless, the Mexican War was where it got Colt started. He got government contracts to make these revolvers, and it sort of put him in business, and it was a big deal. So suddenly, by 1849, the company is sort of really doing pretty well, and they're scaling up, and they're making money. And Sam Colt gets, the whole world takes notice of this invention. And by 1851, literally 4 years after starting out as basically a penniless inventor who had already failed at one business, within 4 years he's an international celebrity because this invention was one of the great inventions of its generation. These are some of the people that he hobnobbed with. You know, he would get to know these celebrated personalities, and he would sell them guns or give them guns. And on the left there is Giuseppe Garibaldi. He was the Italian freedom fighter, and the famous his insurgents wore these red shirts, and so he's got. And Sam Colt had one of these red shirts himself. He must have liked thinking of himself as Garibaldi. I don't know. And on the right is Sultan Abdul Mecid from Turkey. I'm sure you can Google any of these people, and but these were people he sold things to. And then this is Louis Cassu, who was also was Hungarian, and he was a freedom fighter. And all in this period, 1840s, this is a period of the European wars and rebellions of liberation, where one country after the next in Europe were throwing off their monarchies. You know, the United States was the envy of the European world anyway, in the early 19th century, because we pulled that off. We got rid of the monarchy. And we had government by consent of the government. People were looking at this. It is so easy to take freedom for granted. It's unbelievable what it's like if you don't have it, you know. And so people understood this, and they loved what the U.S. represented. There's Sam Colt, who personally, he sort of epitomizes the American sort of idea. And, oh my, this is the...
It's in Rome.
Victoria Albert.
Yeah, Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy.
The wedding cake.
Yeah.
And this is, let me just get my little notes, I should know. Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Sam and Elizabeth Colt meet each other in 1852 in Newport, Rhode Island, and she's kind of a blue blood. And, you know, her father was a big shot, and her grandfather was like a West Indies investor in Ohio lands, and she could count 3 colonial governors of Rhode Island in her ancestry. So she had all these root ties to Newport, and family ties to Newport. Her mother was from Newport, and Newport was a much bigger deal, frankly, in the 18th century than anywhere in Connecticut was. So, so she'd go to Newport in the summer, and Sam Colt would go to Newport in the summer. What would have interested Sam Colt? The answer is not recreation. What business? This is a tough question, but if somebody gets it, you get a prize. What business interest would have brought Sam Colt to Newport in the summer?
Munitions?
What?
Munitions?
Yeah, sort of, but why?
Good.
Fort Adams.
Good answers.
Railroad.
The answer is that the Southerners liked to get the hell out of Dodge in the summer because it was dangerous and you could get, you know, it was hot and it was miserable. And these were the slave owners, but also the generals and the military people. It is not an accident, as we're again talking about politics, they were saying about how if you're going to run for president in South Carolina, you better be serious about national defense, because that's what South Carolina has been doing for most of its history is, military. So that's who it was. So he'd go there to hobnob with the generals and make contacts to sell guns. And so he meets this young woman, and they kind of fall in love. And then in 1856, they get married, and they together they got a diplomatic appointment from the President of the United States to represent this country at the coronation of the Russian Tsar. So they went to all the right parties, and these are some of the party favors. They got this little gold and diamond encrusted snuff box that was a gift from the Tsar. And so there are all these in rings and just beautiful things. So it was really beginning to look like super glamorous, right? And they went to St. Petersburg, and they went to the St. Petersburg, the famous opera house that in St. Petersburg. And then they also, during this period, Sam Colt is always being strategic about making friends and influencing people. And in 1854, the United States embarks on a military operation with Japan. And not to get into a long story about that, but Japan had been closed to the West for 200 years. And the United States, one of the great military achievements, diplomatic achievements of the 19th century, was opening Japan to the West. And Matthew Perry, a naval admiral, commander in the American Navy, led this expedition that opened Japan to the West. And he brought with him, because Sam Colt made it possible, some gifts for the emperor. and some gifts. You know, when you're over there, just let the Japanese know about my little product here. This should be a gift for the emperor. So again, people would open the box and they'd see this newfangled invention and they loved it. And so they sent gifts back, little presents to the Colts. These are things that some of the first examples of Japanese artwork to make their way to the United States. In 1851, Sam Colt represents the United States at the first World's Fair in London. It was called the Great Exhibition, and he had a display, and again, he's networking with royalty and making friends and influencing people, and so again, his celebrity continues to grow. The next year, he is nominated to become a member of the London Society of Mechanical Engineers. He was invited to lecture to the British House of Commons about American manufacturing. So this is a guy who, in 4 years, went from penniless and obscure to an international celebrity. This is a painting from 1862 that it was called Men of Progress, and it was sort of a group portrait. They didn't all pose, it was a composite. They put all these folks together of the captains of industry at that time who were on the vanguard of building America's industrial might, and Sam Colt is pictured. That's at the National Gallery in Washington. In terms of the Colt Armory, the building that we know now with the Onion Dome, that was the third Colt Armory in Hartford. The first one was shown here on Grove Street, basically the present site of the convention center. And from 1849 until 1854, right during that period he was becoming famous, Colt's factory was in this little brick, not little, but smaller brick building on Grove Street. And it was during this period that he hired Elisha K. Root to be his chief engineer and machinist. And Root is the guy who put together all the mechanical elements that perfected the manufacturing process. And without going too deep into it, the way guns are mass produced, the thing about these revolvers, they have lots of moving parts. And each part has to be precisely machined and made so that they are to like a 10,000th of an inch exact, one piece to the next. And that process of mass producing metal elements with that level of perfection and duplication, similarity, was part of the achievement of what they call the precision engineering or precision manufacturing revolution that Colt was part of. And this guy, Elisha Root, was an important part of that. He had perfected some of those technologies working for the Collins Axe Company in Collinsville. Some of you will know that. The factory building is still there. But when he was hired away by Colt at $5,049 a year, it was the highest salary anybody had ever been paid in Connecticut. In 1854, while he's in Britain, he gets this idea of this factory village. He wants to create Coltsville. And he has this vision for a city within the city where he would control lighting and heating and have a railroad spur and a dock on the Connecticut River and housing for the workers and a church for the workers. Its own little community within the city. And he comes back, and in 1853, he starts quietly amassing property and using other people's names so they wouldn't get the idea that he was buying everything up. And he amassed like 200 acres on the floodplain and then began building this extraordinary flood control system. Civil engineering, it was one of the most ambitious acts of civil engineering Connecticut had ever seen up to that point. Although the Windsor Locks Canal, just up the street here, in Windsor Locks, in the 1820s was certainly a huge act of civil engineering, a big kind of project. So he begins amassing the land, and in 1854 they begin construction of the Colt Armory that we know now, and then in 1855 he occupies it. except that in 1861, actually in 1864, it is burned during the Civil War. So the building that we see now was actually essentially a reproduction based on the original. It looks very much the same. Colt Armory building, onion dome on the Connecticut River. And, you know, this was his trademark, the Rapid Colt. This is an industrial corporate trademark, if you will, where the Rapid Colt was a symbol of, you know, kind of energy and animal spirits and loyalty and patriotism. There were a lot of symbolism wrapped up in it. And the onion dome, the rumor was always that some sultan had given it to him or whatever. But what it really was just a symbol of, you know, he'd been to Russia, he'd seen these Islamic architectural features in the eastern part of, you know, St. Petersburg, and he liked that. He thought that it gave his business a kind of international image. And you can see that the onion dome, and then you've got like the little gold world, and that's Sam Colt's little horse. It's kind of a representation of himself dancing on the world. See, he's grandiose. And you can see that the factory was really impressive. And this became, again, a technological miracle, in a sense, a marvel, that people traveled. The most famous actress of the 19th century, Sarah Bernhardt. Everybody knew who she was. She was the most famous theatrical figure of that generation. She visited Hartford at one point. It was the most exciting thing. It was all in the newspaper. Sarah Bernhardt is in town. And the first thing on her list that she wanted to see was the Colt Armory building. You know, she wanted to, because everybody had heard of it. So a lot of famous people stopped in. And inside, the sort of miracle of it was all this machinery. And if you ever get a chance, if you've never been, and maybe next summer, really any time, but if you head up to southern Vermont, up to Windsor, right up 91 to Windsor, Vermont, there is a museum there called the American Precision Museum. And it is the best museum in the country around the subject of industrial manufacturing and machining. And it sounds a little dull, but it's not dull at all. And there's some wonderful, these machines were the great marvels of their era. The technology that made the guns was actually more impressive than the guns themselves. And so you had all these machining processes, and it's amazing. So many of them were documented and illustrated in the not newspapers, but the illustrated magazines at the time. And Sam Colt, among other things, he actually had a staff photographer in 1859 when photography was brand new. He was really interested in documenting everything he was doing. And these are some of these photographs. They turned up, well, a few years ago. Some of the very earliest photographs. I mean, the Smithsonian would feel like, you know, they'd die to have these, because these photographs are incredibly rare, and they show the inner workings of industrialization at the birth of the industrial age. And so very, very cool. And they show, you know, people using this machinery at Colts. Okay, well, now there's another little piece of this story which takes us to Springfield. And in 1836, Sam Colt has come up with this concept. And his father thought, well, all right, this sounds plausible. Let's do some research. Let's figure out, if you want to make these guns, let's figure out what the industry, the gun-making industry is about. And so they traveled, they did a little circuit ride. They went out to Falls Village, Connecticut, which was the center of the iron industry. And they went to Springfield. And they went to several places. I think they met with Eli Whitney. They went to Springfield because the Springfield Armory was, at the point that Sam Colt got started, the most sophisticated gun manufacturing facility in the United States. And it was founded in 1794, I think, by George Washington in the second U.S. Congress. And the idea at the time was that the United States, the country, needed to be able to produce munitions because, you know, if we ever got in a war again, it's not too cool if you have to buy your guns from a foreign adversary. You know, so the country was about security, national security, the ability to make firearms. And Springfield Armory is a National Historic Park, and the Coltsville National Park, which is in the process of being developed, will be co-administered by this, the Springfield. There'll be one staff maintaining and caring for these two parks, right 25 miles from each other here on the Connecticut River. So it's very, very interesting, and it's really part of the story. And it goes beyond that, because Hartford and Connecticut spawned this incredible, there were all of these gun makers by the Civil War era. And this became, people used to call it the Gun Valley. And, from New Haven, where Winchester was, to Springfield with Smith & Wesson and the Springfield Armory. There were Sharp's rifles that are famous. The Henry rifle was invented here. The Spencer rifle. And so these, it was kind of like, when we did our exhibit, I guess I coined this phrase. I called this area the Silicon Valley of the 19th century, because it was a region where a single revolutionary industry was concentrated, and there was a lot of back and forth between these companies. And the products are really interesting. Whatever you think of guns, they are complicated and, in fact, beautiful things, just from a design standpoint, and we certainly made them here. This is the Sharp's rifle. We actually, the Sharp's Rifle Company started in Windsor, Vermont. And actually, if you go to that museum, it's still housed in the 1840s brick armory building where they made guns. And this fellow, Richard Lawrence, was called Robbins and Lawrence. And as they began expanding, they reached a point where they needed access to capital and money and investment and labor. And so they moved to Hartford, because Hartford was a better, more centralized place to be making these guns. And they had a factory basically on the present site of the Hartford Current. And Sharps and Colt were both running full steam ahead with more than 1,000 employees each. Big deal in that time during the Civil War. And these are some of the revolvers and weapons that Colt made. Again, most of what I'm showing you here are in the Wadsworth Athenaeum collection, which is really extraordinary. I mean, the Athenaeum has, again, Sam Colt's personal collection of revolvers, and it's one of the great. And the other great collection in Hartford belongs to the Museum of Connecticut History at the State Library across from the Capitol. So between the Athenaeum and the State Library Museum is really the largest, best collection of Colt material in the country. And we can do more with that. Among the revolvers, these are great, that they own at the State Library. These revolvers, Sam Colt had these really super deluxe examples that he made as presentation gifts to people. It's kind of like bribery, really. But, he'd give some head of state or some general, courtesy of Sam Colt, custom design, my pleasure. And that would win friends and influence people. Well, these deluxe presentation models had the feature that they were engraved with beautiful scrolls and flowers and ornament and inlaid with gold. And so they're like jewelry. They're absolutely incredible. These are 3 examples at the State Library, the world's record. There are only maybe 25 of these known that he ever made. They weren't production models. He never sold any of them because they were gifts. And the world's record for one is 5.5 million. So, they have 3 right there in Hartford. And these are the presentation boxes. I mean, these things were they were status symbols. They were also practical. The economy model, weren't all that expensive. You got the stripped down models. They worked the same way. And you didn't have to have the gold inlaid boxes and all the bells and whistles. But Colt was a master marketer. He really knew how to sell, and he knew how to package and present things, and the design of the guns was part of its allure. Well, over the years, it's always fun for me, and I will mention this again at the end, I have a couple different Facebook sites that I administer, and I post stuff when my wife and I travel around. We go to museums all year long and poke around. They're always discovering things. And anywhere I ever go in the country, I'm always interested when I'm in Nebraska or California or Texas or anywhere. I'm always interested in Connecticut stuff that wound up somewhere else. The greatest, for example, piece of 17th century Connecticut Valley furniture known. The premier treasure, the one thing, if you had a magic wand and could bring it home to the Athenaeum or to anywhere, would be this one thing. It's at the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. So there you have it. You know, not every great treasure from Connecticut stayed in Connecticut. So I'm always poking around, and almost every historical museum I ever go to has at least one Colt revolver. They're everywhere, and they often, the ones that get preserved, have these amazing stories about them. You know, in terms of who owned them. And for example, clockwise from the left is a Colt revolver that belonged to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Next one is belonged to Buffalo Bill. Another one belonged to Governor Joseph Trumbull here in Connecticut. And a fourth one belonged to Confederate General John Hunt Morgan. So these are Colt revolvers with a backstory to them. And it's a lot of fun to discover those, which I do from time to time. Branding, that idea of it was fascinating. That you know, to create a logo for a company, people just didn't think that way in 1840. But Sam Colt did. He had this real sense of, you know, and again, not to weigh in on any of this, but whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, nobody can dispute that this guy knows how to promote things. He's a self-promoter, and I think that he's good at it. He may offend you, but he's good at self-promotion. And Sam Colt was extraordinary. He was one of them. He was kind of like P.T. Barnum, you know, in the way we think of P.T. Barnum. So this is his family crest that he invented. The rampant Colt symbol that he perfected, that he made the trademark of the company something that was personally symbolic. His name was Colt, so of course he played off that and used that as part of the thing. And then there are many pictures of him, and he would pose. He had this sense of self-presentation, and these are some great early images of him. He also used the revolver. Even the guns themselves had narrative content to them. The barrels had these beautifully engraved scenes that showed the use of the revolver. In other words, the guns were decorated in a way that reminded people why the guns were necessary. And he helped perpetuate a lot of sort of the mythology of the West. And, you know, let's face it, I mean, if you woke up one morning and decided that you had it with Connecticut and wanted to go to the gold rush in California or out through Indian territory, it didn't hurt to have a little self-defense. So he played to that, the idea that you could pass through these difficult, dangerous places if you were armed and able to take care of yourself. And he was the first manufacturer, first industrialist to use art as a marketing technique. He hired this then famous artist named George Catlin, also worked with Currier and Ives, and they created these images that dramatized, that created a sense of drama and romance to the use of the gun. So that was part of that. And again, he kept networking and making friends. You know, and the other neat thing at the Athenaeum, there's all these letters that were written to him by famous people, fan mail, and he collected. He was always hustling people for testimonies. If you like my gun, write me a letter. Be like an endorsement. And there are letters from Bill Gates. That's not possible. Yeah, Sam Houston of Texas, Jack Hayes, famous Texas Ranger, and Captain Samuel Walker, shown here. a very sad story, but Sam Walker was a Texas Ranger who collaborated with Sam Colt on some design refinements that made the Colt revolver successful. So, okay, so he's making all this money, things are going well, and he decides to build this new factory and create this factory village. And this is Coltsville, the body of the empire. When I talk about Colt's empire, it was, you know, they really built a whole city within a city. And these are the bird's eye views in the maps that show all the land from Wethersfield Avenue to the Connecticut River, from the north section of the city, not the city, but the north section of the area, which is not too far from what is now the convention center, all the way down to the southern point. Trying to think what the landmark there would be. Well, I guess the Charter Oak Landing, if you know what that is, along the river. But it's a huge piece of land and property, and they colonized that. And he also, as he built the factory and offices and worker housing, he hired artists and photographers to document the evolution of this factory village. And look, the miracle of the whole Colts thing is that it's still intact. If you think about Connecticut industry, if you go to the Naugatuck Valley or out to eastern Connecticut, where the textile mills were, most of those industries, if they made it through the Depression and World War II, didn't make it much further. And I'll tell you, one of the things I've only learned this in the past year, the most devastating year of the 20th century for Connecticut was 1955, the year of those famous Diane, and I forget the other one's name, but the two storms, the floods in the Naugatuck Valley and Eastern, whole towns, Danbury, Winstead, Torrington, massive devastation, and many of these companies, these textile mills, were wiped out by that. I mean, they were already sort of on their last legs, and this was just, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back. But the thing about Colt is they were still making guns here in the 1990s, in this building. So they survived into the 90s. Our exhibit was in the 90s. They hadn't been out of there for more than a few years at the point that we raised awareness of the importance of this story. So everything was, not everything, but most of it was still intact. It hadn't had 30 or 40 years of neglect. And you can see the worker housing, pretty amazing. And they still, there were like 40 units of worker housing. They're now like 20. But, and probably you've read about what they're doing with the adaptive reuse of the factory. They've got apartments and small businesses. I mean, it's really the Capital Region, correct, Capital Region Education Council, thank you, occupies a lot of the space there, so it's an evolving thing. This was a building called Charter Oak Hall, and Sam Colt built this a community center for the workers, where they had a company band, and they had a reading room, a museum within this. I mean, it was a real function, a store. So there were many amenities in Coltsville. And in 1859, the way he built the flood protection system was, you know, building up these huge walls, these embankments, and then fortifying them, planting willow trees on the summit of these embankments. And the willow trees grow fast and they plant deep roots, and it was meant to solidify the embankment against floods. And in 1859, somebody comes by and says, you know, I'd like to buy, would you, you know, if you'd let me trim the trees in the spring and get rid of all the roots, you know, the little shoots that had grown up the year before, you know, I'll pay a little bit for it. He goes, why? What would you do that for? He said, well, we make wicker furniture out of the willow shoots. And Colt thought, well, that sounds interesting. I think I'll make wicker furniture out of it. Thanks for the idea. So they created the Colt Willow Works, which was its own separate little factory in Coltsville that made wicker furniture. So they were very enterprising. Well, in 1856, he and Elizabeth get married. And off they go. It's the first vacation, if you want to call it that, is honeymoon, first time away from his work in 20 years, since he was 20 years old. He's now maybe 42, I think 41 at the time that he is married. And they go off to Europe, and it's this grand tour, and they're gone for 6 months. And during that time, the architects and the builders, they're building a mansion, so that when the Colts come back for their honeymoon, their little pad will be ready to occupy. Well, it was the biggest thing anybody had ever seen in Connecticut. 27 rooms, gas lighting in every room, its own heating system, its own lightings, coal-fired gas lighting supply. Just an amazing tour de force, both artistically and technically. And this shows it as it looked right, at the time that it was completed. It had this incredible steel and glass conservatory for flowers and fruits, and it was, they had servants and gardens, and it was, this was, like Downton Abbey. I mean, in fact, I think the head maid, spoke 4 languages, and it was all very cosmopolitan and worldly. They had 1,400 linear feet of greenhouses that sprawled off the back. And again, amazing thing, a lot of this stuff is documented. And the greenhouses and the gardens, and you can see here they're pruning the grapes. I mean, it's just a level of opulence people around here couldn't even dream of 1 generation earlier. A deer park, orchards, just incredible, sprawling estate. A short walk from the factory. I mean, it was really occupied, that one area. And they, again, loved flowers and the greenhouses. And this is Elizabeth Colt shown here in her, I don't think she got her hands too dirty, but we never know really. She's in her gardening mode. You can see this picture of her with one of her trophy plants. So it's all pretty nice. And then they hired this guy, Robert Copeland from Boston, first landscape architect in America, one of them, to design these incredible gardens on the estate. So it really had all that going for it. And it was influenced. The Colts, again, had traveled in Europe, and they had this idea. This is Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. I mean, they were trying to replicate the kind of high European living that they'd seen in their rarefied travels. And these are the Colt mansion. Elizabeth Colt lived until 1905. And basically, the estate survived pretty much intact into the postcard era. And those of you, if you collect postcards, you know a little bit about them, you know that there was a period of about 15 years when there was just this craze for postcards. And thousands of photographers went all over the country, really all over the world, photographing things of beauty and importance. And so there are these incredible photographic documentation of the Colt grounds and the estate and the gardens and the statuary. And there were artificial ponds and artesian wells, and it was just, extraordinary. They had sculpture. Again, they had reproductions of famous European works of art from the Louvre and from the National Museum in Berlin, Germany. And, just amazing stuff that they reproduced that was on the ground. So this was like a, again, a palatial, like something people had never seen. And, the Colts, Sam wanted people to realize that he'd made it, and that the guns had worked out. He was obsessed with the Charter Oak. Now, the Charter Oak, you might think, why? And the Charter Oak in 1840s became, this is so weird, you can't believe it, but the Charter Oak actually died while the Colts were on honeymoon, which was, this was like the biggest news story of 1856. That the Charter Oak had fallen over and died. After 400 years, it was this legendary tree with a legendary story. And the reason that Charter Oak became an international landmark in the 1840s, goes back to that whole thing about freedom and self-governance, because the Charter Oak had become a symbol at a time when everybody in Europe, in Germany, and in Hungary, France and elsewhere, in Italy, they're thinking about liberation and throwing off the yoke of monarchy and moving into the new age of freedom and self-determination, which is, as we can see, this is still not a process that exists for every country in the world. I think it's pretty clear. But Europe, it was coming new to this. The United States had it. The Dutch were a republic, but many parts of Europe still had these monarchies. So they're throwing that off, and the Charter Oak is like, the Americans, when the evil monarchs in England wanted to take away their rights, they hid the charter in a tree and defied them. So that's part of the mythology of Connecticut. And Sam Colt loved that mythology. He saw himself as a patriot with a capital P, and he was, through his industry and enterprise, was going to bring the United States even greater levels of glory and worldly renown. So he loved the oak, and when the oak died, he was also very good friends with the person that owned the oak. The oak was not public property. It was on somebody's property, private house down in the South Meadows. The guy's name was Isaac Stewart, and Colt said, sent him a telegram and said, I'll buy all the wood. I want all the wood from the oak. If it's dead, I want to buy whatever it costs. I want that oak. So he bought a lot of the oak and wound up commissioning these incredible German craftsmen that worked at Colts, that did the engraving. They did a lot of these artistic and mechanical processes. They worked big German immigration at this period. And not all, but many of the workers at Colts were new immigrants from Germany. And there was a German woodworker, craftsman, who made this Charter Oak wood into this little throne here that was commissioned. It looks like the Charter Oak. It's in the shape of the Charter Oak, and it's made out of wood from the Charter Oak. And it's a very strange, odd thing. It's at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It's the only thing that's kind in the country, and I'm sure if that was ever put up for auction, it would bring $1 million easy, because it's such an iconic treasure. And he didn't just stop there. They had their first child, Samuel Colt Jr. They made a cradle with the wood of the Charter Oak. It's a little strange. And they had Lydia Sigourney. That's a whole story in itself. She's a good friend, poet, famous international figure, Hartford woman, poet. And she wrote a little poem that was affixed to the cradle, and it was all about, being a patriot. And so the little baby was being indoctrinated and brainwashed into good behavior, which might be necessary these days. But nonetheless, that was that. And then the last year of Sam Colt's life, he commissioned this beautiful little ivory engraved little. It's like a little light stand, and it had gaslight behind it, illuminated at night. And it had the scenes from the Battle of Bunker Hill by John Trump. It's just kind of an amazing little artifact that he made as a Christmas gift for his wife during this last year of his life. And then he dies. And this was, all the money in the world cannot immunize you from tragedy. 1862, January. Elizabeth Colt is pregnant for the 5th time. They had already had 4 children. 2 of those children had died young, before the age of 2. Not that uncommon in that era, but tragic nonetheless. They had a 3rd child that lived, and a 4th child, a daughter, that was still living. And on January 12th, Sam Colt dies. He'd had rheumatism and some other medical issues, and he dies. He's 47, and it's over. She's pregnant at that time that he dies. And 10 days later, their daughter dies. And then a month or 2 later, the baby is stillborn. So she loses 3 children and a husband in 1 month. And pretty awful. And, and she is in mourning for a long while. It's a little complicated because she's still the biggest, richest taxpayer in the city, and there's a business to run, and there are issues to deal with, and she still has her own, her son is still living. And now she's inherited this incredible empire at the age of 36, richest woman in America. And she begins in 1864, a couple of years later, turning her hand to memorials and to enshrining. It's very interesting that when John F. Kennedy died, this is a famous story, Jacqueline Kennedy, famously, they always talk about her shaping the myth of Camelot and burnishing the image. Jackie Kennedy, wanted to control to some degree how her husband would be remembered. And Elizabeth Colt really did this as well. And so she commissions a biography of Sam Colt that some would call a hagiography. It made him look like he walked on water, but nonetheless. And her personal copy was, this is it, was bound in the wood of the charter oak. And these are some of the memorial letters. Lydia Sigourney, every time, it's so sad, one of the Colt children of Sam Colt died, Lydia Sigourney would dash off another poem, a memorial poem. She was good at that. And these are some of the really interesting things that have survived. They hired this incredible artist, Edward Bartholomew. Nobody remembers him today, but he was one of the most famous American artists of the 1850s, and he was from Hartford. And they knew him, and they hired him to do a little, that figure of Elizabeth that I showed you, that's of him. Edward Bartholomew made that, and then this is their baby, the one that was in the cradle. Sadly, that baby died, and Sam Colt and the children were buried in the backyard. I mean, this is sort of, they had a little burial, they call it the Sacred Grove of Graves, and she eventually moves the bodies and herself when she dies, to Cedar Hill Cemetery, but at that point, they were literally in the backyard. And this was a section of the exhibit all about death, kind of grim, but it was an important, overshadowed the story in a way. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, in 1864, at the height of the Civil War, never completely proven, but the theory was that Confederates had kind of infiltrated the Colt Armory, and there was an arson, and the Colt Armory building, 1864, burned to the ground. And there were stories for her father talking about Elizabeth standing in Armsmear, looking out the window, and watching the onion dome at the end of the fire collapse into a heap into the center of the bricks, and all this empire, this jewel, this symbol of triumph and achievement reduced to ashes. Pretty awful. And a little funny, I don't know if it's funny, Sam Colt hated bankers and insurance people. And and they didn't like him too much, because they wanted a little piece of the action. He wasn't giving it to them. His attitude was, nobody helped me when I was penniless, and I don't need you now. And he built the whole darn Colt Armory out of cash flow, which is just astonishing. So he didn't have investors. The company was completely owned by the family, a privately owned business. And but Elizabeth Colt, after he dies in 1862, goes, not so bad about insurance. So she takes out a big policy, because it's sort of the right thing to do. And then 2 years later, it's like the biggest claim that Aetna ever had to cover. But one of the things that built the insurance industry was that the insurance industry in Hartford was pretty sophisticated about turning lemons into lemonade. And when they had a disaster, they'd use it as a marketing opportunity. They said, well, we're going to pay this off, and we're going to let the world know that we could pay it off. So that will go, wow, if they can do that, they can maybe take care of my stuff. So they used it, this is an advertising broadside showing the great industrial fire of Hartford, buy more shares of Aetna. So that's how that worked. 1864, Cedar Hill Cemetery is the big public works project. It's a big new initiative in the city, and she decides to get behind that. And she builds this monument. It's the biggest thing. It sort of set the tone for the Gilded Age. And the biggest monument still to this day at Cedar Hill is the Colt Memorial Monument at the cemetery there. And she moves the bodies, and eventually, when she dies, 40 years later. She's buried there as well, but it's a towering work of art. It's at Cedar Hill Cemetery. She builds a museum within her mansion. It's the Colt Arms collection, the memorial gallery with all the trophies and gifts from heads of state. So if you visit Elizabeth Colt, she can take you up and you get the cook's tour of the Sam Colt legacy. And all that stuff, or most of it, wound up coming to Wadsworth Atheneum, again, including the diamond encrusted snuff box and the patent rifles and all the different instruments that were part of his rising story. As I say, she commissioned from Henry Barnard, who was a famous name and also lived in Hartford, wrote the biography of Sam Colt. It's really, it's a good read and a great story. And she had the book itself, everything these people did, they did big. And they did deluxe. And when she was doing this biography, she not only hired one of the best writers in the country, but this was one of the most expansively illustrated books of its period. It had many, many illustrations. And they hired artists and photographers to document everything. And then the book binding. The book itself won an award at the 1867 Paris World's Fair for the art of bookbinding. She commissions these memorial portraits. Sam Colt's gone, but she's fine-tuning how she wants it presented. She likes it so much she commissions one of herself and her son. So these are the Colt memorial portraits, also at the Wadsworth Atheneum from 1865. And little details like these are some of the trophies. This was a gift from the King of Siam. And it appears in the painting, see? And so it's kind of neat that the Atheneum owns some of these objects, and then they are the very things that were incorporated into the portrait. And you can see, again, these details from these two portraits. She then gets this idea of having a private art gallery. Sam Colt loved art and had dabbled a little bit with collecting art. But another little story, Elizabeth Colt was born the same year as the famous Hudson River School artist Frederick Church. And they actually were both from, Elizabeth Colt was from Saybrook, but she went to high school in Hartford. And she lived with her aunt on Asylum Hill during those high school years, right next door to where Frederick Church lived. So the two of them literally knew each other as teenagers. And he had stayed in touch. At this point, 1865, he's the most famous artist in America. And she gets in, helps him. He helps her build this famous art collection. It was the premier art collection in the city right up until the 20th century. Even more than the Atheneum's art collection. The Colt Memorial Art Gallery at the mansion. You can see it here. And there was, incredible pictures. European art. This is Frederick Church and a painting that was commissioned by him of Jamaica. Views by Sanford Gifford and Albert Bierstadt, some of the kind of the who's who of American art, of the Catskills, of just the scenic American views. And then these sort of biographical European portraits, suggestive of the things that interested Elizabeth Colt. She was a great benefactor of social, created a social service aid organization for widows and children. Did a lot of the, what we would now call welfare philanthropy was not handled by the state. It was run in the 19th century mostly by privately funded church-based philanthropies. And that's, she wrote a lot of checks to a lot of good causes during her life. And these are some of her paintings. Again, all of this stuff is at the Wadsworth Atheneum, and it's very biographical. The pictures she chose tell us something about who she was. And her travels. In 1881, her son, by now an adult, is interested. They kind of hoped he'd grow up and take over the company and be like Dad, but he was more interested in girls and yachting and partying in Newport. Maybe that makes sense. And he, at 21, came into his little 1/4 share of the estate, which I've never done the exact math, but I think by the age of 21, when he came into his inheritance, he was certainly worth the equivalent of $50 million. So, maybe it was more than that. Even half that. actually even 1/10 that, might be enough so that you wouldn't really feel that you absolutely needed to work. And he didn't. He liked hunting and entertainment and yachting, and he was a great yachtsman. He was the Commodore of the New York Largemont Yacht Club and the Vice Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, and he raced in the America's Cup, and he had this boat called the Dauntless. It was one of the famous racing boats of the 19th century, and he and Mom went on, they closed, well, I don't know if they closed it up, but they left Armsmear in the hands of I'm not sure who, for a year in 1881 and did the grand tour of Europe. It's the only time she ever went back. And they visited Rome and Berlin and all these places. And she brought back yet more paintings from those adventures. So these are some of the pictures. In 1867, she gets this idea that she wants to build a church, a memorial church for the Coltsville community and to honor her husband and deceased children. So she commissions one of the leading architects in the country at the time, who later went on to design the Mark Twain House. His name is Edward Tuckerman Powder. She hires him to design and build the Church of the Good Shepherd, which is down in Coltsville. And it was described when it was new, opened in 1868, as the finest example of ecclesiastical architecture in America. Again, going big and going opulent and sparing no expense. And it's just got these amazing features. If you ever get a chance, you know, I've given tours there, other people give tours there. We actually did this thing, I'm very proud of it, right before December. You might have read a little bit about it in the newspaper, but we did this, it was called Christmas Christian Heritage Tour. And I didn't come up with the idea, but I was involved in it. And the idea was that we were going to visit these churches and learn a little local history by visiting churches. And we went to First Center Church, Christ Church Cathedral, and the Church of the Good Shepherd. And it was a 2-hour bus tour thing. And it was absolutely spectacular. These places, I loved seeing the way people responded to them and the stories you can tell there. And this Good Shepherd really is a national treasure. The stained glass on the interior. How many of you have been there? A few of you have been inside Good Shepherd. I mean, it just, your eyes pop out of your sockets. It's like a jewel box. It's such a beautiful thing. And we're so lucky to have these things in this area. And some of the finest stained glass in America. And she gets involved in 1864. These are some of her activities about the same time. She's the president of the Hartford Soldiers' Aid Society. This is during the Civil War, and they raised, she and her women friends, they raised the equivalent of millions of dollars for medical relief for the soldiers. And she brought some sort of things to sell as part of their fundraising, including this, they had a lot of that charter oak, you know. So she got those German workers to bang out a few of these little decorated cups made out of charter oak. People love that stuff. The Union for Homework, a social service agency, she was a founding president of the board, and probably put up most of the money to create it. This is in an age, and again, this is after the Civil War. There are a lot of women with children and no husbands because they died in the war, and this was an unprecedented scale of social need that the country didn't know how to meet. So the churches and private philanthropy met it, a lot of it. And she was right there on the vanguard. This is the Union for Homework facility that she created. She also founded the Hartford Art School. She was interested in art, and she was the president of what was called the Decorative Art Society. The Hartford Art School was an independent art school for 80 years, and then merged with the University of Hartford. And this is Elizabeth Colt in a little theater masquerade fundraising thing they did. She's depicting the character of Dolly Madison. I won't go into the long version of that, but this is her. She was the first founding president of the Colonial Dames, the Connecticut Society of Colonial Dames, and that was in 1894. And she, you know, at this point, she's built, she's commissioned statuary. She's built the church. She's built the memorial house. She likes building things. She gets involved with the Colonial Dames in a project to create a monument to the Spanish-American War at Arlington, Cemetery. This is shown here, and she attended the dedication of this in 1901 and was seated on the, the dais, the platform there with President Theodore Roosevelt. She moved in pretty high circles. So, and by 1901, by the postcard era, people hadn't forgotten Sam Colt, but Armsmear, the mansion, Coltsville, the empire, this was hers. People knew that it was Mrs. Colt at this point, who for 40 years after her husband died had maintained stability, productivity, and the sort of drama of this extraordinary moment in industrial history. Her son, as I mentioned, was married, not married, he had his 21st birthday party, a little party to celebrate his coming into his inheritance. And it was one of these, they'd have these events there. Her sister was married in Armsmear. Occasionally they'd have parties at Armsmear that were just, made national news because of the gifts and the people coming in by private railroad cars. And, it was a level, and, it's important also just to mention that in the 1870s, in this period, Hartford was so rich that according to the Hartford Current, 1/7 of the taxes collected by the state of Connecticut were paid by Hartford residents in this period. And it was kind of like Greenwich is now, but maybe even more so. It's kind of hard to believe. So this is, again, she hired the same architect, Edward Tucker and Potter, to redesign her library at Armsmear, which was her office, her kind of a place where she did business and people would come, and it was her, and she was really leaving her stamp on things. She built the art collection. She built this amazing ceramics collection, something I've lectured on, just on that. Things she went to the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia and rounded up. These are things she brought back from the Centennial. It was such a thrill for me to work with this stuff, because it was such utterly unique. And in the world of antiques, most stuff, it's pretty and maybe it's well crafted, but to have those qualities plus a human story just makes everything so much more interesting. This is that cameo glass. And look, I didn't know anything about this stuff, this kind of thing. But I learned as I was working on the exhibit, and I did a book about it. And at one point, a guy had written a whole book on this kind of glass, came to visit, he wanted to see it. I always like to meet an expert on something like that, find out get their assessment of it. He said, these are very fine examples of what this is. So I said, well, good. That's what I want to hear. This is Hungarian pottery. Zolne is the name of it. And there are people that, at the time, some of this stuff has become quite collectible since, but at the time there was literally no books, at least in English, that were written about some of this stuff. Italian, French, and Japanese ceramics. These are all things she amassed. This is the yacht. I'm so sorry I can't, again, the purpose was to project these so you could see them big. But the boat was 120 feet long, and one of the most interesting pictures, if you're right in the front row, you can see it, but that I've shown all night, this is the stateroom in the yacht. And, it's bigger and way more opulent than what passes for a dining room in our house. So and yet this is a boat, and that means he not only had a professional staff that helped run the boat, but they probably brought a cook along. This is, you don't just travel with a suitcase. You travel with a suitcase and a retinue of help. And it must have been pretty fun. And some of the cool stuff they brought back, I always loved this chair. When we started on this project, belonged to Colt. It's a reproduction, a copy of some throne at the Doge Palace in Florence. I've never been, I don't know. But, and it was in horrible, the veneer had popped off, it was in terrible condition. The upholstery on it was all threadbare and kind of moth eaten. There were two of them. I said, let's take the best one and preserve it, don't touch it. And let's take the one that is in the worst condition and restore it. And believe me, it was expensive, and we probably spent 3 times as much money making this chair look good again as it would bring if you sold it at NATO's or someplace, because you know, people aren't wild about this stuff. I'm not saying it's great art, but it is part of the story, and I was thrilled to be able, and some of this stuff sort of makes your skin crawl, these 6-foot-tall gold pedestals, and, you know, I think that, you know, some probably look good in Saudi Arabia or someplace, but, you know, I don't, you know, it wouldn't be my taste. But nonetheless, you know, I don't make the news, I just report it, so that's what they had. And this is her reception room, where she did a lot of her fundraisers. It was a pair of rooms just furnished to the nines at Armsmear, the mansion. She then, this is sad, her son, the yachtsman, dies in a yachting accident in 1894. So now the only heir to the Colt empire is gone. And now Mom has no children. And she lives another 7 years. And she decides to build a monument to her son that would rival, it was a parish house for the church. It's called Colt Memorial House. And it is absolutely, again, if you get a chance on a tour sometime to come see these things, it is, I think it's the most, that and the State Capitol building, which is amazing, are two of my very favorite. I mean, they're right up there with the Mark Twain House. If I were trying to dazzle visitors to Hartford with the glories of this Victorian legacy, this is one of the buildings I would take them to. It's really amazing. The interior of it is amazing. And it's just, it's such a treasure. So, and this, the carving, this Bavarian sculptor named Albert Entris, German immigrant who came to Hartford in 1860, spent a year and a half, full-time, doing carving, stone carving for this building to complete the decorative scheme. She again continued to embellish the gardens and grounds. After her death, she left 100 acres to the city of Hartford as Colt Park. She commissions this memorial statue. So her last big project was commissioning this statue, the Colt Memorial statue in Colt Park, that has, you know, that sort of depicts the little boy genius as a teenager coming up with the idea, and then Sam Colt as the captain of industry, the master of Coltsville. And she leaves the mansion, her house, and endows it as a retirement home for women of clergy and other women of good character. So it is what it is. And it has been doing that job for 100 years. It is a place, if you were looking for, I mean, it's a really interesting place to live, and it's a very affordable place to live. They charge you something, it's not free, but it's scaled to your income. And so it's you know, it always has a waiting list, and it's quite remarkable to live at Colt Armory. Probably a little less remarkable than it was 70 years ago when Hartford was a little more prosperous, but it's still a pretty neat thing. She then leaves money to the Wadsworth Athenaeum to build the Colt Memorial Wing. First wing of a municipal art museum in America, commissioned by a woman. And she fills it with all these Colt treasures. And that's why we were able to do this, because this collection is really a national treasure. And when you think of the industrial age, all the great names, there are almost none where so much stuff has been preserved, where you really have the material evidence to tell the story and the physical plants. I think this Coltsville National Park, when it finally happens, really will make a difference. And I'll